I'm Jennifer Keller, Programming Coordinator at the Westport Library. Today I'm honored to introduce Dr. Kelly Marino, a professor at Sacred Heart University, who will talk about the growth of women's activism since 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified. This presentation is part of this year's Westport Reads series. Hi, Dr. Kelly Marino. She is a historian of 20th century America with a focus on women's history and the history of sexuality. She has degrees from the University of Massachusetts and earned her PhD from Binghamton University. Dr. Marino is currently working on a book about the connections between advances in women's higher education and the women's rights movement in 20th century America. Welcome, Dr. Marino.
Thank you. All right, let's see. Get my PowerPoint up here for us. Started at the beginning. Okay, so on the first screen, I just have my title, which is The Legacy of Women's Suffrage Activism on Campus. And essentially, you know, my research really looks at higher ed and how like first wave feminism or this women's suffrage movement really influenced, I think a lot of the scholarship focuses on how the influence on government and politics. And mine looks at like the cultural influence on education, academia, schools, civic education, and some of these other topics that don't, of course, you know, the 1 minute that I'm doing this, my phone actually rings in the house. That very rarely happens, but I guess it's a reflective thing, doing this in the midst of coronavirus and sort of this weird world of working from home and not in my office. But again, so a lot of my talk today is going to be looking at, okay, so 1920 happened. What was the effect on colleges? Because there was effect during the suffrage movement on campuses and colleges and on higher ed and afterwards as well in the aftermath of 1920. Okay, so the first slide that I have on here is sort of like an overview about some historical context. Just to give us a starting place for this talk. So the 19th Amendment is sort of my starting place, 1920. It is ratified by the 38 states, needed for it to become law. And I'm not going to read every single bullet point on my PowerPoint. Some of the stuff I put up just for people to sort of like browse through while I'm talking. But so 1920, who can vote in the US, like when this amendment passes? Well, the consensus is today that it was mostly white women. The people that were excluded still at this moment, despite this legislation passing, were Native American women, Chinese women because of citizenship laws at first that were in place, and also African American women as well. We know, and especially in like some southern states and rural areas, there were discriminatory policies in place that prevented them from really exercising the franchise until about 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And so it wasn't this complete victory. It was an important moment, I think scholars concede, in the women's movement, but it wasn't like this complete victory. I think that people had hoped at this moment in 1920. All right, let's see if I can get my next slide. So the way that when I thought about my research, because this presentation is based on the last chapter of my dissertation project, which I'm working on changing into a book. I had to come up with research questions, like a couple things to kind of guide, you know, my thought process as I was looking at like the primary sources and the literature on this topic. And so the starting place for me was, what were the legacies of the women's suffrage movement? And particularly because that's such a big question, I had to narrow it down for my own research to what were the legacies in higher education and for college campuses and university campuses. And then the second question that I thought about was, was the women's suffrage movement a success or a failure? Because a lot of early scholarship sort of, and even accounts that were created by activists, grappled with that question. And the reason for that is because you would think, like intuitively, it would be like, of course this is a success because 1920 this legislation passed, but it really, people have really debated, you know, how much of a success it was and how to really think about it for a variety of reasons. One is that after 1920, the statistics on voting across the country showed that there weren't large numbers of voters, like there wasn't a large percentage of voting increased after this period. Even among women, there was tons of women who weren't even exercising the franchise now that they had it after this period. So people said, was this movement really a success or a failure? If it was a success, in what ways was it a success? And I'll talk about what my conclusions were in regard to these questions at the end. Another question I had to think about was, were there two distinct waves in the women's movement? So if you look at a lot of the early literature on the history of women's rights in the US, they talk about it as occurring in two waves. The first wave feminists were the suffragists at the turn of the 20th century, and then the second wave feminists were the activists in the 1960s and 70s who were getting involved in the ERA and reproductive rights and economic equality and all of that. That's looked at as the second wave. And so what they've said, like these are a lot of early studies, is that in between these two periods, so this would be from like 1920 to 1960, for example, it was called the interwave period, and there was a doldrums or a dulling of activism during this time period. So I had to think about, you know, as a researcher, do I agree with that? And I'll tell you what I think at the very end. Again, I'm just establishing what the questions were. But the last major question I had to think about was, you know, how did the concept of practical politics, which I'll define in a second, help to bring women into the electorate and to civic life after 1920? So what I mean by that is, you know, after I was looking at the primary literature, like the sources, when I was doing my research, I noticed that a lot of women's organizations were kind of using this this philosophy called practical politics in their campaigns, like post-1920. And so what practical politics means to me, like my interpretation of that as a scholar, is it's sort of like hands-on civic education. So prior to 1920, you know, and I'm not saying I don't think anything is always true for every situation historically. So I don't want to say everybody did this. But there were a lot of women's organizations that would encourage to prep women for citizenship, especially in the final years of the suffrage movement. They were encouraging women to like study the campaign or study citizenship and voting in the government. And a lot of it was very academic and very, it was based on like reading and, you know, like considering these different issues in their minds and kind of looking at books and literature, but it wasn't like very practical. I'm not saying all organizations didn't have a practical component to citizenship education, but I'm just saying it seemed like the predominant trend was it was a lot of research and studying, and it was very academic. And after 1920, it seems like there's more of a shift to this attitude where, yes, we need to teach women and have them read about some of these issues and the way the government works, but we also need to give them civic experiences to prepare them for full citizenship and involvement in public life in a way that they had not been involved and engaged before. So that's practical politics. Like, it's no longer enough to have women just studying the government and politics. They need these civic experiences. And we as women's organizations can provide them with these civic experiences that can familiarize them with government spaces, for example, and motivate them to vote. Because, you know, if a woman is reading about casting a ballot, you know, that's not the same as actually having been in a polling space or having been in a government building. As they've entered these spaces, they become more confident in them and comfortable. And these are all male, typically, historically, have been all male spaces that have been closed off to women. So these groups after 1920 want to establish this familiarity and comfort with entering these civic spaces and these political spaces that had been closed to them. And they thought if we could do that, maybe we can get more women to vote. And so they like establish a lot of the groups I'm going to talk about, and there's three I'm going to like talk about briefly today that take this approach. And the way that they implement it is they use like similar tactics. Like one is to hold like citizenship institutes, political discussion forums. Some of them have this practical skill development. So they have these programs where women actually go in and practice filling out a ballot, like sit there and actually do the act of filling out a practice ballot. Or, you know, eventually, especially by the 20s and 30s, a lot of people were transitioning to the online vote, or the, not online, oh my gosh, totally not what I meant, the actual voting, the mechanical voting machines, right? More and more places were using those, not paper voting practices. And so there's a whole, like you have to learn how to use the voting machine to register your vote. And so they were having the women come in and actually practice, like punching all the buttons and pressing what they need to press to record their vote on the new technologically advanced voting machines that they had at this moment. Another thing that they did is they started to bring women on field trips. So they would literally take them, they would organize like a field trip or an outing to a jail, to a courthouse, to like some of these spaces that had been like closed off to them before. again, to get them more comfortable with this idea of being on equal terms with men in civic life and in the public sphere and in some of these political spaces, judicial spaces as well. And another thing they tried to do is give women experience in activism and organizing and participating in electoral campaigns. And the goal of all of this, the goal of practical politics, was to help transition women from being outsiders to insiders in the political process. So the way that, you know, like if I was teaching this to students, I would make like a comparison with what's going on sort of now with the coronavirus, because I would say, okay, well, a lot of us as teachers have had, you know, to transition and learn how to teach online. And so we've gotten all these certificates and we've got these really quick programs to teach us how to transition. But these aren't things that have been often in place for a long time for the majority of faculty. These are like little quick sort of things to get us up to speed. And that's what like a lot of like the League of Women Voters, they were doing all these quick things to get women up to speed, because some women prior to 1920 were preparing to be full citizens, but a lot of women were not. And so these organizations had this purpose of how do we like quickly get women up to speed with men in terms of their knowledge of even just how to do like the practical aspects of being a full citizen and filling out this ballot or using a voting machine. So it's very interesting and I think important work. So again, I'm going to look at the League of Women Voters, the National Women's Party, and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs today, and how they did some of these things. And especially like my focus is really going to be how they encourage like young women, you know, to start thinking about, you know, becoming, you know, voters, because, you know, the voting age back then was 21 for many, many years until I believe the 70s, it was 21. And so these women were, while they were in college, they had to like prepare for these new duties. And these groups tried to, after 1920, to start prepping them and for the people that had the vote to get them up to speed, especially quick, so they could be actually, you know, casting those ballots and maybe working a government job, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so the League of Women Voters, just a little overview. A lot of these quotes are from their website, not all of them. The bottom ones are historical, but like the top ones. You know, it's a nonpartisan activist grassroots organization. You know, the goal is to create a more perfect democracy, educate women voters, and I think they would argue rally political participation among both men and women. I think it's really expanded to be inclusive of even just getting Americans in general motivated to vote at this point. Like I said, I'm not going to read every single thing on my PowerPoint slide, just because I know I do have some time constraints. But the background on the League of Women Voters, just to give us like a little bit of context, it was founded in 1920 in Chicago, about 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified. And it was the successor of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and a group called the National Council of Women Voters, which was a Western organization. A lot of states in the West passed women's suffrage legislation at the state level prior to 1920. So they were thinking about, in a lot of these Western states, citizenship education and, you know, what the next step was earlier than in a lot of other areas. And so this is like a little timeline on the next slide in terms of the origins of the LWV. In 1909, at a NASA convention, a suffragist named Emma Smith DeVoe, who I think there's a book out on her, she's a Western activist, she proposed originally this idea for a National League of Women Voters. At first, you know, the leaders of NASA were not really receptive to this. In 1909, at that moment in the women's movement, like people were not really, you know, suffrage seemed more likely, but they were not as confident in it as they were in 1917, for example. From 1917 to 1918, that's when people started to really think about the future more. Like it wasn't just about winning women's suffrage, but what's going to happen afterwards? What are the next steps? And part of the thing that gets people thinking about citizenship education is the culture of World War I, which Americanization becomes important during this time period, even more important. It's a very patriotic, nationalistic time period. People are thinking about rights. And also a lot of suffragists and NASA start to think about citizenship education work in the World War I era, because there's a big thing that happens in 1917, and that's New York State passes women's suffrage legislation. That was a huge victory for suffragists because New York is a huge state, And so to win this very big state, to get it to vote pro-suffrage in the northeastern area, you know, that's something sort of unprecedented. And people start to say, now that New York passed state suffrage legislation, we think we're going to get this 19th Amendment through. And so now more and more of NASA suffragists are saying, like, they're able to think about other things and other priorities at this moment and say, okay, we need to, you know, if we want to, you know, continue, you know, our efforts to engage women in politics, we have to start thinking about the future and, you know, getting women to actually exercise this ballot and be prepared for it. So it's during this time period that NASA starts to think about citizenship education and a lot of the things that become central to the work of the League of Women Voters once it's established, not long after. I just made a note on the PowerPoint slide in red that says the CWSA, the Connecticut Women Suffrage Association, was particularly pioneering in the citizenship education work that was going on during World War I. They had a guidebook on citizenship that was actually influential throughout the Northeast. They had all of these institutes and schools at places like Connecticut College. That was a big location that they used for a lot of their activism. And it was really like they set a lot of trends that were important for shaping the League of Women Voters work in not just in the Northeast, really throughout the country, you know, in the years that followed. So our organization from our state suffrage organization, was very more influential, I think, than it often gets credit for in many, many ways in this movement and campaign. That's a little aside, but 1919, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was president of NASA, starts to talk seriously about forming the League of Women Voters. And by 1920, it's a reality. The League is formed. The first president of the League of Women Voters is Maud Wood Park, who's in the picture on the PowerPoint slide. She was a skilled NASA lobbyist and an ally of Carrie Chapman Catt. She was working in DC, heading the congressional committee that NASA had to push for the federal amendment. She was a former Massachusetts teacher. She had established all kinds of grassroots organizations to push for women's right to vote in Massachusetts. One of the things that she's famous for during suffrage, and this is what my larger project really does focus on, is the founding of the College Equal Suffrage League. And that was a group that she created with Inez Hayes Gilmore, who was a fellow teacher at Radcliffe College alum. They founded the organization in 1900, and the College Equal Suffrage League was about recruiting college and university educated women, students and alumni to NASA. So when she takes over, the reason that this is all relevant is that when she takes over the League of Women Voters, when she becomes the first president, she gets that appointment, she doesn't forget that past. And so she doesn't forget how important that she thought education was and having educated women in the movement was. That still is something that is important. She makes it a priority for the League of Women Voters as well when she's the leader. So, you know, when she kind of establishes herself and the League gets sort of established, by 1924 and 1925, she starts college campaigns for the League of Women Voters on campuses. She authorizes that. And these continue for many decades, up until about, you know, mid-century. And the League of Women Voters has actual campus chapters. They have college clubs for students ages 18 to 25. And for the League, it's an opportunity for women of similar age and class to get together and talk about political rights and inequality and civic education and all these things that are important to the organization. It's getting young women together to think about these things, to talk about them, even before some of them had the right to actually vote legally. And this was actually pretty popular. At the height of this, there were actually 85 campus chapters of the League of Women Voters. That's a lot of grassroots chapters. And one of the things that's important about all three groups that I'm going to talk about today is, I just want to highlight this, is that they all had different gender ideals that they promoted for women, for young women. And that's going to be significant when I talk about the conclusions of all my research at the end. But every one of the groups had sort of this different ideal for contemporary womanhood that they promoted among the younger generations. And for the League of Women Voters, I believe that it was really the idea that the ideal modern woman was an active citizen for them, or another way to say that is a civic leader. And so again, they were really, to get women to be these active citizens and civic leaders, they started grooming them while they were young. And they wanted to foster these use that concept of practical politics to foster these actual contacts with the government. And these are some quotes from the primary sources, a sense of reality of politics for these women. So how do they give them political experiences, early on? Well, in a lot of different ways. One of the things that they were most famous for was having citizenship courses, schools, and institutes and discussion forums on college campuses for students, where the students could learn about domestic and international political issues that were going on during the time period and that were prominent. And it was interesting the way this operated. At first, a lot of these courses and institutes were extracurricular opportunities for women. They would put them on their resume as something that they did or were involved in, sort of like a student club. But eventually over time, the schools really liked these and they thought they were valuable. So all of a sudden, the schools started to provide college credit if you completed a citizenship course that the LWV set up or an institute. The organization even at certain times submitted certificates of completion. Like if you went through a citizenship, again, I'm making like present connections. Like for example, if I am doing this, taking an online teaching course this summer, that my university has created, I'm going to get a certificate of completion that says I know how to do online teaching. Well, during this time period, these women, because they're trying to quickly get them up to speed on politics. Now they can take these short courses, like these citizenship courses. A lot of times it was in the summer where these programs were going on, and they get like certificate of completion, so they can quickly show to an employer, for example. And that's where it was most useful for when these women were getting jobs, that they were, prepared to take this government position or to take this position in a state office or to have some of these new jobs that were being created as a result of the 19th Amendment passing, or to even have a public job. In certain ways, having these skills might be valuable in certain professions. So these things were actually useful for the women during this time period. And valuable. Like now it's like, why would we need a citizenship certificate to show that we could vote? But back then, or to have a job, but back then it was actually like a useful credential. Like I bet our online teaching certifications eventually will look archaic because that'll just be built into graduate training and programs probably eventually that prepare people for their careers. But it's kind of an interesting thing. And that's what they were doing again during this time period to kind of minimize the gap between men and women in terms of their political knowledge and readiness for some of these duties and rights and exercising some of these rights. So I have a couple examples on the next PowerPoint slide, and obviously like the larger project has many more, right? But these are two examples. In New York, the League of Women Voters worked with Columbia University in 1923 to have an Institute of Government and Politics. And you can see some of the top topics that were discussed with students. These are just some of the topics at that event. In Massachusetts, the League of Women Voters worked with Harvard and Radcliffe in the 1920s to have a foreign affairs school on campus for women. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. It went on for several times. And they had all of these guest speakers come in. So it wasn't like the students were just gathering and they were talking about these issues, but they actually brought in like experts and professionals, like lawyers and people that had political figures, political positions to come in and actually interact and talk with the students and lead the discussions. And so, it's giving women these contacts, so all of a sudden these politicians don't seem like these very distant figures from them that are really far-fetched and sort of they don't have connection with. They're bringing the students right into contact with these people, so they're comfortable with them. So when they grow up, maybe they might be comfortable, working for, a Democratic organization or a Republican organization, or just being comfortable, again, like interacting with politicians and not feeling like they were so far above or out of touch. Like these were ways, again, to make women comfortable in the political scene. And so I think that was, I think it had a useful purpose at this moment after 1920, and for, especially for a while into the 20th century where there was still a lot of sort of discriminatory gender ideals in place and still limitations on what women could and could not do. And a lot of these events did have the practical elements where they had the classes on how to register to vote and how to read ballots and how to, and how to use voting machines and things like that as well. Other things the League of Women Voters did: helped to sponsor female political science faculty. A lot of schools at this time did not have a lot of women professors in political science. So they helped to endow these chairs of citizenship at schools like Barnard and Bryn Mawr. So they'd have female faculty. So now these students would have role models, and they'd see other women, educated women like themselves, up there teaching classes on government and politics. Again, normalizing women's political participation. And you know, these instructors would teach the students in class. They'd give public lectures for the LWV, and so it was really interesting that the League did this, and I think really important. And also they arranged field trips for students as well, as I mentioned earlier, to civic spaces, to state departments, so they would actually, you know, see what it was like to work in these places, they looked like, see what the culture was. Massachusetts League of Women Voters did this. New York League of Women Voters did this. They arranged internships, volunteer positions for students in government work, so they could, again, get a sense of what this was actually like before they became eligible to vote or do some of these things after graduation. And for the League of Women Voters, a lot of universities liked the initiatives that they were creating, the internship opportunities, the citizenship, civic education training, and eventually a lot of it became institutionalized. You know, by the 60s and 70s, a lot of schools were implementing some of these things that the League had started at their university officially into their programs. And so as that happened, a lot of this work became less and less necessary by the League because it became part of the curriculum, part of the institutions. The League wasn't without criticism. A lot of people always historically had been criticizing the League for its nonpartisanship and saying, you know, that it was drawing women away from existing political parties. I think, you know, it had historically, like at different moments, a conservative reputation because it was slow to get on. A lot of the original branches were racially segregated, so you'd have an all-black branch or an all-white branch. And so it was a little bit slow to integrate at moments. It was slow to back the ERA. It didn't withdraw, the League didn't withdraw opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment until 1954. It was actually worried about women losing protective legislation at their jobs at first. And so these things kind of lost the League respect and favor a little bit over time. And I'm just praying that no one's coming into, I just heard a weird noise. I'm like, please don't, I hope that was just the mailman. That's not someone coming in and doesn't realize I'm doing this presentation. It's being recorded into my house. All right, so the next group that I'm gonna talk about was the National Women's Party. And the National Women's Party was a little bit different than the League of Women Voters and NASA. It was much more controversial, and it was formed in 1916 in Washington, D.C. The original goal of the National Women's Party was to pass the 19th Amendment. After 1920, obviously that goal had been achieved, and so they had to rethink things. And so it became about then passing the Equal Rights Amendment. And so I argue that their vision, the National Women's Party for young women, was to encourage them to be political lobbyists for the ERA. So they not only talked to women about their political rights, political inequality, that any inequality that still existed, but they also talked to women about inequality in other realms, like social and economic realms as well. And the League did that too over time. But I'm just saying right from the start, this was a primary focus for the Women's Party. And just a little bit about the origins. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who were suffragists, formed or were put in charge by NASA of the Congressional Committee in 1912 in Washington, D.C. The Congressional Committee of NASA fought for the 19th Amendment, lobbied the government basically in D.C. That was the sole purpose. A lot of the NASA branches were historically focused on state campaigns, and this was like a particular branch that was focused on the national campaign for women's right to vote. But Alice Paul and Lucy Burns came into conflict with a lot of NASA leaders because they were more radical activists, they were more militant, they had a different vision that was inspired by their experiences in Europe with the suffragettes. And when NASA sent them to DC, they didn't give them very many resources. They didn't give them very much funding, for example. And so Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, in order to have their campaigns, they had to raise money. And so in 1913, they create this group called the Congressional Union. And the whole purpose of this is to raise money so that the Congressional Committee could hold their national campaigns. But NASA doesn't like this. They don't like that they're not in charge of where this money goes. They're not happy with some of the protests that the Congressional Committee had been staging. And Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and the National Women's Party, not yet the National Women's Party, the Congressional Union break up. Alice Paul, breaks away, and Lucy Burns from the Congressional Committee in NASA, and they take the Congressional Union, sort of a separate group at this moment. Eventually, it transitions into becoming the National Women's Party by 1916, their separate group and their followers. And that is, it starts during the National Women's Party starts during the suffrage years. And so that's a little bit about the history. So after 1920, after they achieve the 19th Amendment, again, the Equal Rights Amendment becomes the new focus. And by 1923, Alice Paul is drafting the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's introduced to Congress for the first time. And again, the goals of their campaign now have shifted, from a focus on winning the vote to a focus on challenging protective legislation for women workers, which they saw as a negative. Some people saw that as a positive. They saw it as a negative because some people said protective, I'm getting totally off topic, but some people said protective legislation for women workers was necessary to make the professional and the occupational sphere equal for men and women. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party said, actually, we shouldn't have, this is not creating an equal environment, having these special protections for women. Why can't women work at night if they want to, or work long hours, for example, or, in any conditions that they want, like men? I mean, we shouldn't just treat women differently. This is what they believed. They wanted social, economic, and political equality for women during this time period. So they really had a more expansive view it was different than some of the other activists. And the ERA was introduced to every session of Congress that follows. That means from 1923 forward, every session it was presented to Congress, and every session it was voted down, until 1972, when it actually passed Congress and actually went to the states at that point for ratification. So it got through the House of Representatives and the Senate at that moment in 1972. Goes to the states for ratification, but this is the but part. Congress had placed a 7-year deadline on the ratification process for the ERA. So the activists only had 7 years to get the 38 states needed for this to become a law at first. And the scholarship says that this is a weird thing because a lot of amendments were never given any deadline. So, why was this one given a deadline? It's and that's one of the things that people are challenging even today, like this deadline issue. And so the ERA gets 22 of the needed 38 states in the first year. And you can look down the timeline to see some of the other data here that I have on the slide, statistics. But it doesn't actually get the 38 states that it needs. Activists are able to get an extension on the deadline till 1982. It still doesn't get enough states. It's missing 3 states by 1982 to become a law. And so what's interesting is in the last couple years, in the last 3 years, 3 states have actually voted, the 3 states that were needed have actually voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is since 2017, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia being the 38th state. But because of that deadline, it's not been able to be made a law. And so the House of Representatives actually voted on February 13, 2020 to remove the deadline, the old deadline and the rules that are preventing this from being a law now. And what we're waiting for currently is for the Senate to actually make a decision on this. And it'll be interesting to see, what happens with that, because there's still a lot of Republican opposition, even to this day, to the Equal Rights Amendment. And I'm not going to get into that because that would bring me in a whole different tangent. I feel like I've done a lot of tangents already. But so this is something that's evolving, this story about the ERA, and it could become potentially a reality in the future, within the next year, who knows? And so I think we're all watching the news to see ultimately what way this goes. And I think it's because of coronavirus that we haven't heard too much about this, because it was an important thing with a lot of focus in the media earlier this year before the coronavirus thing happened. All right. So in terms of college activism for the National Women's Party, Mabel Vernon, whose picture is on the PowerPoint slide, was actually the woman that was put in charge of the National Women's Party's college campaigns after 1920. So before 1920, they didn't have official college chapters or campaigns. Like NASA had the College Equal Suffrage League. The Women's Party did not have that. But after 1920, they did have an organized presence in, among university and college students. And again, Mabel Vernon, who was a suffragist, a college friend of Alice Paul, she was, I believe, from California. I hope that's correct. I guess people watching this, if I'm wrong, will probably look it up and then critique me. But Mabel Vernon was the one that was put in charge of like sort of making choices about this college activism. And one of her things that she said was education helps equal rights. College students could be important allies. She believed in changing misconceptions about women that existed, using their academic influence to speak out. And so the Students' Council, and I love this because it's not something that I don't think there's much on the college chapters of the LWV, but on the Students' Council, there's really, except for like the stuff that I'm working on, is like the secondary stuff to be written about this. And I think it's really exciting. And so the National Women's Party's Students' Council was created in the 1920s, and the young woman that was in charge of it is on the student is on the picture, on the PowerPoint. It was viewed as a college equal rights league for women during the time period. So it's like they got inspired by the College Equal Suffrage League, like NASA's College Equal Suffrage League, and now they have this College Equal Rights League. And it was most of the students that were involved in this tended to be on the East Coast near the DC area because that's where the NWP headquarters were. So this wasn't as expansive as like the LWV's college chapters. It definitely wasn't at that scale. But it was a real thing that had students at different campuses that were a part of it. And some of the different things that the Students' Council did, studying and protesting gender discrimination in higher education, and just in the interests of time, I'm not going to read every single one of the bullet points underneath, but studying and protesting discrimination against women in the professions so that they would have a better future after graduation. So they had a 1924 Women for Congress campaign to get women thinking about political jobs and campaigning against restrictions in some of these positions. They campaigned for equal jury service for women, against discrimination for female attorneys that female attorneys and lawyers faced. In 1932, Goucher College women that were part of this group fought for female entry into all male engineering schools. And so again, they were really thinking about equality in these different realms and how discrimination against women was affecting these students' lives in higher education and beyond. And they also wanted to get women, again, involved in the ERA campaign as lobbyists. And so young women that were representing the Students' Council attended political hearings. They made pleas on behalf of the younger generation to politicians. They petitioned the government, and they worked on the equal rights publication. So before the suffrage amendment passed, the National Women's Party had the paper, The Suffragist. After the 19th Amendment passed, they had a newspaper as well called Equal Rights, and a lot of the students worked on that publication. And they also participated in, the conventions and the pageantry and plays that the theatrical productions that the National Women's Party was so famous for, because they had a lot of demonstrations and gatherings that were very interested in pageantry and theater and making a spectacle. And so the students continue to play an important role in those events and in functions and be in sort of at the forefront in some of those things after 1920. And this picture on the PowerPoint slide is from a pageant to honor Inez Mulholland, who was a suffragist that died. And they also had like events, like when Elva Belmont died and Emmeline Pankhurst, they had like events to honor their legacy, like the NWP many years later, and the students were involved in those as well. The NWP, like the League of Women Voters, was criticized after 1920. It was criticized before 1920, but it was certainly criticized after 1920 as well for a variety of reasons. And it lost support on campus because a lot of students started to join, a lot of women in particular, instead of joining the League of Women Voters or the National Women's Party, they were joining the college Democrats or college Republicans over time. And I think that was because over time across the 20th century, they started to view themselves more and more like we're equal to men. And so we can be in the campus Democrats or Republicans. We don't need to be in a separate political party here. And on some of the other political groups on campus became more popular. the Women's Party, you know, was viewed at moments as radical. It was viewed at moments as narrow and discriminatory, as elitist, as racist. The National Women's Party, through most of the first part of the 20th century, did not have the best record on race relations, and in the suffrage campaign either. They were not known for being like very inclusive, like racially. And that's one of the things that they got a lot of criticism for, like especially Alice Paul, like in attitudes, you know, about protecting like Southern membership and not being inclusive for African Americans. I mean, those things were coming out during the suffrage years as well. And so, you know, there were critiques of this group and their methodology and practices. And the last organization that I'm going to mention today is the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Now, again, this is a group that was active during the suffrage years, and we're thinking about what the legacy was of this group and what it did after 1920. So the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was actually formed in 1896 in DC, and it was formed out of the merger of all these small African-American women's clubs and organizations. It was like a big umbrella group that oversaw the work of all these grassroots groups that had, you know, roots way back to the 1800s in the club movement time period. And it was created as a response to exclusion from white women's organizations. A lot, like I said, it's not to say that, for example, NASA didn't have any African-American members. That's not really true, but they were treated, they were segregated, they were discriminated against, they weren't often, not always, but they weren't often treated fairly. And so this group evolves and develops to give African Americans a space where they can mobilize for women's rights. They're going to have different issues and concerns than white women, that, you know, they're facing different levels of discrimination based on race, class, gender, and a variety of other factors. And so this is a space for them to come together and promote their own agenda and to not face mistreatment at the hands of some of these white organizations that were inherently discriminatory during this moment. And so I'm going to click to the next slide. Their motto was lifting as we climb. And again, they're focused on rights for African Americans, an uplift to improve the status and image of African Americans. And one of the things that they're created in response to not only is the exclusion from mainstream white organizations, but they're created in response to some of the commentary and stereotypes about the African American community, particularly African American women, that were out there in the world and that had historically been out there all the way back to the time of slavery. For example, like the biggest one, and this isn't the only one, but this is the biggest one that I'm going to mention because it seems relevant to stuff that I'm going to talk about today, is the Jezebel image, the image of the promiscuous, the misconception that African-American women were supposedly overly sexualized or promiscuous, more promiscuous than white women. So this is a stereotype that has been used historically to mistreat African Americans all the way back to the time of slavery. And this group is created responding to that, in response to that, and they want to show that no, like African American women are very respectable, just as respectable, and this is the key, in the literature that they created, sometimes it was even, we want to show we're even more respectable than white women at moments and really be the role models and the leaders here. And so they're really fighting back on a lot of these stereotypes, and they really want to be these role models and leaders for contemporary womanhood during the time period. It's very interesting. And so these are just a couple of the issues that they supported. Equal suffrage for Black men and women, because even though 1920 happened and voting rights laws were passed to enfranchise Black men, there was still a lot of discrimination on the local and state levels in a lot of locations that kept them from actually voting, right, in a lot of areas after 1920. And so suffrage is going to continue to be an issue for this organization, ensuring equal suffrage long after 1920. They were against violence, you know, that was affecting the African American community during, you know, the suffrage years and the Reconstruction period. Lynching was still a huge issue. Fighting against Jim Crow and segregation, improving education for African Americans, and also opportunities for the care of children and the elderly, elderly African Americans that were in rural areas, people that didn't have access to the healthcare and resources that they needed. These are going to be some of the things that are on the NACWC's agenda. And so the first president of the NACWC during the time of suffrage was Mary Church Jarrell, who was a social reformer, and she was a very respectable, intelligent woman who guided this organization. Now, my focus, because I'm looking at students and youth, is going to be, a lot of my focus is going to be on the NACG. So the NACG, and I'm also really excited about this because this is another group that doesn't have a lot of literature written about it, is the National Association of Colored Girls. And that was the, that's what the organization's name was. Obviously, you know, in 2020, we don't like use those terminologies, but they used them back then. They used the word colored, and so that's inherently in their title. But the NACG is the youth contingent of the NACW or the NACWC. This is like their youth body. Just like the other groups have these organizations in place and structures to mobilize young people, they also did, right? And it's called the National Association of Colored Girls. And so the leader of that group is Sally W. Stewart, who's a teacher. And she's the first president of that organization. And a little bit about their history, because this is like another, you know, like I said, just like the Students' Council, like this body to mobilize young people. It was founded, the NACG was founded in 1930. And it included young people from ages 5 to 31 years old. Now, it did, a lot of the membership in this group tended to be high school and college students. And the vision, so we were talking about the visions of the other organizations, their vision was turning Black women into, young Black women into community leaders. That's how I would describe it. And so for them, this is what that meant. It meant setting a positive example for others of their race and gender through proper behavior, appearance, and political participation. So again, like the NWP had this more expansive vision, they also have this more expansive vision for contemporary womanhood. They wanted young Black women to be community leaders. And so they would, in the organization, they promoted civil rights, racial uplift, social welfare. It's a more expansive vision for citizenship that included commentary on proper morality and social conduct for African Americans. It was almost like, if you're a member of the NACG, it was like adopting a whole lifestyle, because it's more than just voting or wanting to vote. It's about exhibiting a certain behavior and appearance as well. They actually had a whole guidebook designed just to outline what they expected the ideal conduct for modern women to be. And that was published in 1953. It was called the Girls Guide. And one of the things that they required for their members is Sunday school attendance or affiliation with a church. So they were taking this very seriously. To even be in the group, you had to already have certain qualifications. And their whole thing was about working to stand out by fitting in, like to be exceptional by proving how much you were fitting in and were just as respectable, like I said, if not more a little bit, than other people at moments. And so it was standing out by fitting in. And if you actually look at the history, I feel like I'm getting so off on so many tangents, but if you look at the history of social and political activism, a lot of the early organizers, the early generations of like civil rights campaigners, women's rights campaigners, LGBTQ campaigners, they had this philosophy. Like, we want to prove that we're just like everybody else, we fit in. And then over time, as activism started to become more radical, that changes, right? It's about embracing difference and separatism and celebrating your difference and your uniqueness. But at first, it's not like that. In a lot of these stories, it tends to be the first generation are much more like they're assimilationists almost in their approach to activism. And so some of the things that the NACG does, like they have a movement against African-American illiteracy, and they publish statistics about illiteracy in the African-American community. They want to get more African-Americans equal educational opportunities. They have a scholarship program for Black children and students. They want African-American history to be taught to students in schools, and they have initiatives to support that. They have oratory contests where they encourage members to study the history of civil rights, commemorative events for African-American leaders like Frederick Douglass and Holly Q. Brown, key figures in the African-American community that had been accomplished and were respected. And so these are some of the things that they did. They also had a Girls Week. This was a conference that they held every year, a whole week-long conference where they brought together their members to talk about improving communities and also race relations, the state of race relations and how they could improve those. Because again, now we're getting to like the 1950s when we're talking about the Girls Week, for example, and some of this stuff. And the civil rights movement is starting to take off during the time period. And what's interesting about Girls Week is sometimes the NACG would also invite like white youth organizations like the Girl Scouts, like the YWCA branches, like the I think it was Y Teens. They would invite like these youth groups of other organizations, like other women's organizations, to come and interact with them and be in dialogue with them at these events. And this, it sounds like, oh, I've never heard of this before, but it actually was a really big deal. Like if you actually look at the historical newspapers, there's tons of media coverage of these NACG Girls Weeks. It's in the newspapers, like you could pull up hundreds of articles. In 1956, for example, Girls Week took place in 44 states. That's huge. So, I mean, it seems like, because there's not a lot written about this, that it's some obscure thing, but it really during the time period historically was not. And eventually, like the League of Women Voters, they started to have citizenship schools and civic education programs. In 1960, they had the first citizenship school or civic school at Howard University. And then they had these vocational training schools and institutes as well that they sponsored, and cultural tours like the League of Women Voters field trips. They also had their own field trips for members and for African-American young people to expand their worldview. So this is just one example. In 1965, they sponsored a trip for students, for African-American students from 8 states in the rural South, 8 rural areas in the South, to visit Washington, D.C. and New York City. And they took the students to the Statue of Liberty, to UN offices, to the White House, to Arlington National Cemetery, to the National Archives, because they wanted them to see some of these different locations again, so they could start thinking about themselves as the full citizens that they really were at this moment, and get comfortable with politics and government and being active. And you know, I think that these different groups also have power in recruiting the younger generation. So this is the final 2 slides of my PowerPoint. It's like the summary of my research and the arguments that I came up with about all of this. One, the first point that I keep like in conclusion was that practical politics did indeed help to transition women from outsiders to insiders in the political process. I think these campaigns were important among the youth. And another thing that I argue, right, is that feminism didn't fade after 1920. I don't believe that there was a lull. I don't really see it as being 2 waves, but more of continuous activism across the century. Now, if there was any kind of a non-focus in the interwave period, it was because of a lack of publicity, because a lot of the strong activism during the interwave period was on the grassroots level. So I think that's why the narrative historically has always been these 2 waves, because a lot of the stuff that was going on that, you know, continued to go on in the interwave period was at the grassroots level. And so sometimes the stuff that college students, for example, were doing, which could have been very like prolific and fruitful and strong in terms of activism quality and level, but maybe it didn't make national media headlines during that time period or end up in the newspaper the way that, you know, like a campaign for an amendment might, you know, because in a lot of student stuff was going on campuses, maybe it was showing up in their paper, but it wasn't in the national media in the same way. Also, I argue that if you look at the history of the women's movement on campus, some of the early scholarship tends to argue that it emerged first, the women's activism on campuses in the 1960s and 70s as a result of anti-Vietnam War protests, civil rights demonstrations. But my research, even my larger project, says actually there's like this whole tradition of organized women's rights activism in the academy that goes way, way back into history that sometimes I think we forget about. I think when we say college students protesting, immediately the image in our head is like 1960s and 70s, like activism. But really, we forget like all the stuff during, you know, this interwave period and, you know, the stuff during the suffrage period, all this activism that had been going on historically. Also, when younger women followed older women into politics, they stayed there. You know, there's arguments in the literature that I came across about this narrative about a graying of feminism after 1920. I didn't find that when I looked at college students on campuses. I found that feminist activism and women's activism in general, in different forms and capacities, was alive after 1920 and across the 20th century. But I do have some buts, right? And one of the buts is that after 1920, I do think it's fair to say that there wasn't a strong feminist front. So during the suffrage movement, there was a very strong unification of women's organizations under this goal of winning women's suffrage. There was a strong feminist front, or a strong front of women's activism. I do think that it's true that there was fragmentation after 1920, not necessarily a lull, but a lot of divisions among activists during this period. And I think that I argue in the way that it's relevant to my own research on young college women is that during this period, women's rights organizations didn't just harbor different political goals, arguments, and tactics. That's acknowledged that happened, but it wasn't just that. They also undercut each other because they advocated competing gender ideals and visions for contemporary womanhood as well. So they actually had these different images that they were promoting that I've mentioned throughout the presentation today, that was keeping them divided. There was no consensus on what the ideal modern woman looked like or should be like. They all had different visions for that ideal modern woman. And I think that kept a lot of these groups very divided after 1920. And then my last point is that I don't, in my own research, I wouldn't argue that the women's suffrage movement was a failure. I think that too much of a focus has been on women's suffrage and how it affected politics. And people don't always take a step back and say, how did women's suffrage and how did the movement in general affect society and culture? And I think if you start thinking about how it affected society and culture, and you start to not think as much about voting trends after 1920 or voting percentages, the significance of the movement itself becomes much more enduring and much more important. And I think, I'm just looking at this one aspect, right? And so I think that it had an effect on, and this is an obvious one, on understandings about gender ideologies that were really significant. But I also think, even more importantly, it had a cultural effect. And my own research looks at the cultural effect in terms of higher education, how it affected campuses. And so, those are some of the things that I came up with on this topic in my research.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Marino, so much. This has been truly eye-opening, I think, for all of us who've been studying the passing of the 19th Amendment and everything else that's been going on. So on behalf of the Westport Library and the Westport Reads Committee, I thank you for sharing your time and your expertise.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun prepping for this, because this is material I don't always get to talk about, so.
Fabulous. So to view the library's suffrage exhibit online and for more videos and information about the Westport Library and other talks that we've recorded, please remember to visit westportlibrary.org. Thank you so much.